All right, welcome to Dot Point PS17, and today we're looking at constructing a flowchart of steps involved in processing the raw agricultural commodity into various forms. So the important thing in this dot point is that it says processing and raw commodity. So whenever you get asked a question about this dot point, it's going to say processing or it's going to say raw, or it might say both, but it will say one or the other. So processing or raw is the key thing about this dot point. So basically these are the steps in the processing of the raw product, and it's effectively talking about what happens at the abattoir and just around that point. So we've got maybe feedlots, and from the feedlots they go to the abattoir, to holding yards. They get slaughtered at the abattoir. They get processed, they get chilled, they might get transported to somewhere such as a butcher, further processing, and then the final product and packaging. So the holding yards before slaughter are basically used to let the animals calm down before they are slaughtered, so they're not stressed. Now let's have a look here at each step and what happens, an outline of each step, and then there's basically one past HSC question on this dot point. So feedlots are basically an intensive production system where animals are confined to a small area. They're fed usually high amounts of grain and silage, and they're fed for maybe 100 or more days. And so once they get over 90 days in a feedlot, their fat turns creamy white, which is wanted by supermarkets normally, white fat. And then feedlots allow their growth rate to be controlled and allows their fat to be kind of uniform color and depth, so they're all the same. And then it helps overcome drought conditions because you're feeding them and keeping them inside. Holding yards, or potentially outside, but at least undercover, and you're controlling their feed. Holding yards, on the other hand, once you get to the abattoir, they're kept there for a number of hours or a day maybe before they are actually slaughtered. And so they're unloaded at the abattoir. They're inspected to ensure that they're fit and healthy and not diseased, because they're not going to be slaughtered and put into the food production system if they're diseased. They're not usually fed much, enough to keep their energy levels up, but they're definitely given a lot of water beforehand. Once we get to slaughter in the abattoir, basically we use advanced techniques these days which are considered humane. So the animal will walk down a race, they'll be stunned, they'll have a bolt fired through their brainstem, and it basically kills them immediately, and then their throat is slit eventually, and their blood drains out so that there's no blood, or not much blood, left in the carcass. It's then lifted up by the hind legs and moved onto conveyors, and so how that's done can affect the meat quality. Processing after that is basically converting the animal into meat, and so the meat, fat and bone is what a carcass is. All the other bits like head, hide, skin, etc. are all not the carcass. They're all excess, and they're used for other things. So they're removed. The ear tag or the NLAS tag is checked and marked as that the animal's been slaughtered. Internal organs are removed, so what we call offal, and those are saved for either consumption, such as liver and heart and brains and things like that, or might be used for fertilizer, blood and bone, other things like that, animal, dog food, stuff like that. The carcass will then be trimmed of excess fat and bruising if there is any of those things, and then it'll be weighed, and normally the payment for that animal will be calculated on the weight of the carcass, and so usually 55% of the live weight of the cow will end up being carcass. So the yield is 55% of the live weight, which gets turned into a carcass. After that, you have chilling. So the carcass needs to be chilled. If it's done too quickly, the fibers will contract and the meat toughens, and that's called cold shortening. If it's done too slowly, it's called heat shortening, and the meat toughens again. And then the carcass is usually often cut in half and hung on hooks. It then might be transported to a domestic consumer or a retail butcher at a supermarket, for example, in refrigerated trucks, which helps extend the shelf life. And there's various standards and Oz standard controls to make sure that it's kept at a certain temperature, that it happens in a certain amount of time, that they're handled in certain ways to ensure the quality. Then there might be further processing. Sometimes this can occur at the abattoir, or sometimes it might occur further elsewhere at butchers, etc. They'll debone them. The carcass might be cut into primal pieces, so the main large pieces, boning, cutting and slicing, and then they might cut them into the individual retail cuts, so the small cuts that we actually end up eating. The final packaging or product might end up in multiple things. So there's multiple things that might come from each carcass or each animal. Frozen meat normally is stored at minus 18 degrees. You can have it vacuum packed, where you remove the air from the packaging, and the shelf life is basically 6 to 10 weeks. There might be byproducts such as glue, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, soap, candles, cosmetics. Edible meat byproducts such as offal, or what we call offal, such as liver, kidney, tongue, heart, and brains. And then things like insulin, glycogen, adrenaline are used as well. Here we have a question from 2014 asking identify a processing step. So slaughter is obviously a processing step. And then lastly, identify a consumer product. So sirloin steak is an example of a consumer product that the consumer would eat, for 2 marks there. This question from the trial HSC: for a named product you've studied, outline 3 steps in processing the raw product into a form the consumer would purchase. You can see I've given slaughter, processing, and chilling here, and I've outlined what occurs at each step for a clear 3 there.